Okay, so I want to just start out saying a bit about what logic is even about. And logic is about argument. Specifically, if we're being really precise, logic is about the structure of arguments. And I'll say a bit more about what that means as we go on, the structure versus the content of arguments. But for the time being, I think it's safe to say that logic is about argument. Um, well, then that raises the question, what exactly is an argument, right? And you might be thinking, well, that's a silly question. We all know what an argument is. But, I want to be clear what we mean by argument in logic, what we mean by argument in philosophy generally. Now, when you hear the word argument, you might be thinking of two idiots on cable news trying to score cheap points against each other, right? Or calling each other names, right? Or you might be thinking of that couple in the restaurant that everybody wants to pretend isn't there, right? That's not what we mean by argument in philosophy. Often when we say argument, we mean a sort of verbal confrontation or sort of jousting match, right? That is not what philosophers mean by it. That's not what we're going to mean by argument in this class. When we talk about argument in philosophy, we are talking about trying to give reasons to think some claim is true. And to be more precise about this, an argument is a proposition, or usually a series of propositions, the premises that give reason to believe that some other proposition, or sometimes propositions, the conclusion is true. Sometimes arguments can have more than one conclusion. It's maybe a little rare, we won't be talking about it too much, but it is possible. Well, now this definition probably just pushes the question back a step, or actually it opens up some more questions, right? So you're saying, well, all right, what's an argument? Well, an argument is a series of propositions that are related to another proposition a certain way. Well, what in the world do you mean by a proposition? Well, so Lavin talks about this, and I think he does a pretty good job. A proposition is just a fancy way of saying it's a sentence that can be true or false. Now, there's a little bit more going on here, but that's the basic idea. A proposition is a sentence that makes some claim, and it can be true or false. So here's some examples, just some random ones that I thought of this morning. All prime numbers are odd. The Earth is flat. Pluto is not a planet. Saturn is the second largest planet in our solar system. Mars is your instructor's favorite planet. Lauren is getting married in October. You don't need to be talented at math to do well in this course. Octopi are smart. Now, all of these are statements that can be true or false. It makes sense to talk about them being true or false. Now, you'll notice not all of them actually are true, right? The Earth is not flat. This proposition is false. That one's obvious. If you guys remember math a little more, I'm not expecting that you do, 2 is a prime number, 2 is even, so the claim that all prime numbers are odd is actually false. Not that you should know this because you can't read my mind, but Mars is not my favorite planet. I guess we should all make Earth our favorite planet because we would die without it, but if we're not talking about Earth, I would have to say it's Jupiter, right? It's just big and weird, and all sorts of cool stuff happens there. It's got these moons that also do weird, cool stuff. Mars just really has no comparison. Yes, I have an opinion about this. Yes, I'm a huge dork. These others are, well, I don't know who Lauren is. I just picked a random name. But, these others are, I think, true. Saturn is the second largest planet in our solar system. Pluto is not a planet. Octopi, this is maybe a bit more vague, but my most definitions of smart, octopi are smart, at least for animals, right? Doesn't really matter. The point is that these statements can be true or false. Compare those to these statements, right? These sentences, oof, The professor is using math examples already. Really? You know, those can't be true or false, right? These are questions, these are rhetorical questions. It doesn't make sense to speak of them being true as the claim that Saturn is the second largest planet in our solar system is true. Doesn't make sense to them of them being false in the way that this claim that the Earth is flat is false. I now pronounce you man and wife. Not a question, a different sort of sentence. Philosophers talk a lot about these. They're called performatives. You don't need to know that. Basic idea is just words that do something, but main point here is this is not a proposition. Stop bothering the poor woman with that nonsense about Pluto being a planet. I was thinking this because before the pandemic hit, my wife and I and some friends went to this sort of open house planetarium thing at ODU, and there was this one really jerky dude who kept harassing the poor woman running it about Pluto being a planet. He cared a lot about it. He was sort of an internet troll in the wild, and he really wanted Pluto to be a planet. I don't know why. But someone eventually yelled at him, just stop bothering the poor woman with your nonsense, right? This is good advice. It's not a proposition, right? It can't be true or false in the same way those other statements are. We are commanding this guy to do something or recommending he do something. When is Lauren getting married? What makes you think octopi are smart? Again, different than these other statements because it doesn't make sense to talk of them being true or false. So one reason to talk about this is if some bit of speech, whether written or spoken, is not made of propositions, then it's certainly not an argument. You know, if something is just a string of insults, which a lot of what passes for argument, I'm doing scare quotes with my fingers, not that you can see me, but I am. You know, if something's just a string of insults, well, insults aren't propositions. You jerk, you moron, you communist, you whatever, those are not propositions. That's just name calling. If that's what people are doing, it's not an argument in the sense we're interested in. And when we get to an actual argument, any bits of the argument that aren't propositions aren't part of the argument. Let me give you guys an example. Why do I say octopi are smart? They have a high brain-to-body ratio, which is correlated with intelligence in other species. They can solve mazes and other puzzles in the lab, and in the wild, they can figure out how to poach fish from fishermen's traps and nets. This is making an argument, you know, the effect that octopi are smart. But notice, not all of this is part of the argument, not all of it are propositions. This stuff, you know, the first one here is a question, not a proposition. All this stuff in red, though, those are propositions. Those are part of the argument. So one thing, you know, when we're talking about arguments, when we get more into analyzing, more into the structure, when you're asking, well, what is part of the argument, you're going to drop anything that's not a proposition, right? So, you know, that's really what we need for now, but I want to say a bit more about propositions because they're going to be important in the future. When we get to sort of more formal methods of logic, the actual sort of formal logic we're going to talk about is called propositional logic. And we don't just call it that for fun because we like the word propositional. We do it for a reason because propositions are sort of the cornerstone. And there's some things to notice about propositions that will be important. Some propositions are simple, many are complex. What does this mean to talk about a simple proposition? A simple proposition is the smallest bit of a sentence or a claim that makes sense on its own. Earth is a planet. Pluto is more like an asteroid than a planet. Contrast those with couple others, right? Jupiter is the largest planet in our solar system, and it's also your professor's favorite planet, right? Now look, even this sentence here, Pluto is more like an asteroid than a planet. You might think, well, this is kind of long, but isn't this a complex proposition? No, right? You can't break this down into anything simpler that has the same meaning, right? If you say Pluto is more like an asteroid, you've lost some meaning, right? If you say Pluto is more like a planet, that doesn't mean the same thing. You can't break it down in the same way you can this sentence about Jupiter. Another complex proposition, if Pluto isn't a planet, then there are only 8 planets in our solar system, right? You can break this down. Pluto is not a planet. There are only 8 planets in our solar system. Now, one thing to notice, and if you guys forget this for now, it won't be the end of the world. It'll be important later. Whether simple propositions, like Earth is a planet, Pluto is more like an asteroid than a planet, are true, depends on whether what they say is true or not. Complex propositions, well, they're more complex. Whether they are true or not depends on how the parts relate to each other. Now, we're not going to say a lot more about that for now. When we get to formal logic, sort of more toward the middle of the semester, that's going to be all that that's about. How the different propositions and complex propositions relate to each other. How they relate to each other and how we determine whether this, the complex proposition is true or not. If that doesn't make a lot of sense to you right now, don't get too worried. I just kind of want to introduce this idea because it will pop up later. It will be important. Final thing to keep in mind, a proposition in a sentence, what it literally says and what it expresses, what it means, can be quite different. Metaphor, simile, hyperbole, and so on. And again, we're not going to do a lot of this for right now, but one of the things that will be important, especially later in the semester, we'll talk about translating normal sentences in ordinary English into sentences in formal logic. This fact that what an argument says, or what a proposition says, and the literal words are different, that will be really important. It'll be important even in a few weeks because, we're going to have to figure out what the person's saying. The literal words won't always settle that. Anyway, just some examples of this. I think you guys should all be familiar when you think about it. But some examples of how what a sentence literally says is different than what the proposition it expresses might be, right? If I say Moxie is smarter than Dr. Phil, Dr. Phil's the TV host psychologist. I really don't like Dr. Phil. You might gather that. My dad loves Dr. Phil. Just so much watching Dr. Phil. The two things my dad watches that make my mom the angriest are Dr. Phil and Cops. When I'm home, he'll watch those, and I don't like them either. Just when I'm visiting. Anyway, be that as it may, when I say my dog Moxie is smarter than Dr. Phil, I don't literally mean the dog is smarter, right? I don't have a high opinion of Dr. Phil. I think he's probably smarter than my dog, right? He's not going to pick a fight with a dog that's 3 times his size. Dr. Phil can talk. He can solve simple problems. I'm not literally saying my dog is smarter. This is just a very hyperbolic, a really overstated way to say I don't think he's very smart. A lot of academic jargon is Greek to me. That's just an old metaphor. Or sort of a bit of our language. Just means I don't understand a lot of academic jargon. The baby is so cute, I could just eat him up. I've never said this about a baby. I think it's a little creepy, but a lot of people will say this. Person is not saying, I want to eat the baby. They're just saying something like the baby is really cute. Anyway, this is just a concept to keep in mind. It will be important shortly as we're talking more about, trying to figure out exactly what an argument says, and it'll be especially important in a few weeks when we talk about propositional logic. just want you to notice this for now. If anything, especially this stuff toward the end, is a little confusing, don't worry. I just want to kind of introduce the ideas.